Thanks, Issa. And thanks everybody for joining and online as well. So the title of my talk is The Imperative for Using External Data Sources to Support Medical Device Evaluations. And although the themes today were about external data as external controls, you can see that actually Issa's use of external data was not necessarily to derive controls, but to augment randomized trials. And I think that there's a family of methods that can be used that can use external data as external controls, as augmentation methods, and others. And I'm going to review a little bit of those methods, but also just review, consistent with what Dan was talking about, why we can't just do trials. You know, why don't we just do trials? Because I think all agree that trials are the best way to move forward. They give the most unbiased results. But for many reasons, large randomized trials cannot be feasibly conducted, particularly, I would say, in the US. I do think that we have a particular challenge culturally here for a number of US conditions. And in my space, which is the cardiovascular device, and some of us are in the cardiovascular device space, there's rapid iteration of our therapies. This is probably less true in the pharmacotherapy case, but in devices change fast, procedural techniques change quickly, and so we have a very short shelf life, I think, for the results of clinical trials. It's onerous to contract for clinical trials. It's actually just very difficult to get trials done for sponsors and for academic sites or other sites that do clinical sites. We don't have a national disease registry system that might allow for a registry platform like they have, for example, in Sweden, where randomized clinical trials can be done much more feasibly, less expensively, because they have a standing sort of data collection mechanism upon which randomization can be superimposed. We don't have that here in the United States. And as Dan mentioned, we have a lack of a broad use of exception from informed consent. We have the opposite of exception from conformed consent in the US. We have every single site's IRB making a separate decision on whether or not this trial and the particular language is in informed consent is adequate. And that also greatly slows our ability to conduct trials, and in many cases prevents it. And then also, it won't be the theme of my talk, but it is also important to think about external data for this, which is long-term follow-up in trials is really prone to loss to follow-up. And as we put devices into younger patients who live longer, as the background rates of mortality decline, patients live longer, this long-term follow-up becomes really important. But our ability as sites to follow patients for a decade or longer is really, really both expensive and hamstring. You know, I'm going to go back to this example of cardiogenic shock, and it's going to be a theme because actually 3 years ago we had another symposium, our first. Shortly after, I think Issa came here, joined our group. We had this idea of a symposium. We brought many people from the FDA and industry. Actually, Laura Mori was here for that first symposium as well. And actually, we talked about acute myocardial infarction complicated by cardiogenic shock. And this, for the non-clinicians in the group, is really a grave condition. This happens when people have heart attacks. That is, blood flow to one of the heart arteries is impaired. The heart stops functioning well, it stops beating well. People go into shock. They have low blood pressure. There's not enough blood to their organs, and they result in a very high mortality rate. And that's what AMICS is, acute myocardial infarction in cardiogenic shock. 30 to 50% mortality rate at 30 days, probably more like 50, and no real improvements in this over the long term. Dan showed you that we have very many, an assortment of different devices for how we treat these patients. I treat these patients when I see them in the emergency setting, and sometimes we use these devices, and one of those devices we talked about is the Impella device, that device in the middle, which is basically a heart pump. You put it in through the groin artery, it pumps heart from the ventricle to the aorta. It takes the place in some places of the heart's function, and we have a rapid use of a growing use of this device. Older data now, but this device has continued to be increasingly used. But we had no well-powered trials, and this is my slide in our 2023 symposium, actually. I said we have no well-powered trials to evaluate the effectiveness of Impella versus alternatives among patients with AMI with cardiogenic shock. And observational studies suggest an association of the device with worse outcomes. And that's really what I want to focus on is why would that device be associated with worse outcomes, and why are we using it so frequently? And it comes down to this issue that Sonia raised in her introductory talk, which is, well, what do we believe about the observational comparisons about confounding? And in this case, when I use a mechanical circulatory support device versus when I don't, it's based on a lot of different criteria. I don't choose randomly when I'm going to use this device. I choose it based on how sick the patient looks. Quite literally, if the patient looks like they're going to do worse, I am more likely to use the device. So that is just the absolute preconditions for having confounding. And what makes a patient look sick? Well, it's their severity of shock. It's a whole number of things. Do they have bad heart function, bad lung function? Were they slow to come into the hospital? Are they an active smoker? Do they have poor mobility? Do I think they can recover well? A whole assortment. The list I could probably name, and all the physicians could name, a whole litany of things which might make you think that. And importantly, those things drive our decision, and those things are also associated independently with my use of the device with bad outcomes. So this is like, I would say, this is like sort of the quintessential setup for confounding. This is like if you can tackle this problem in an observational study, I'd say you can tackle maybe any. A few studies are available, are able to account for all of these variables. I'm guessing that in oncology, there are very similar, I would imagine, similar types of questions about confounding when you're thinking about who should get chemotherapy versus who shouldn't get chemotherapy. So our collaboration that we did with the FDA, and that should say 2023, not 2003, is we did an observational study evaluating this device, Impella versus no Impella, using a claims data set. Because we don't have a great national registry. These registries that Dan was talking about now, they weren't as well developed in 2023 and earlier. And so we used a claims data set, Medicare data, and we compared Impella, people who received Impella versus those that didn't, with cardiogenic shock. And what we found is that there were many uncaptured variables that clinicians would think were important in driving this decision. And overall, we found, depending on the method that we used, we could find a whole different set of results. We used an inverse probability. This is work that Issa and I worked on together, really the first, I think, big paper that we worked on together. We used a grace period design to take advantage of the fact that there were sort of dynamic changes in patient outcomes. We used some sort of natural experiment designs, an IV approach, something called an instrumented difference in differences approach. And we found an assortment of different outcomes, and we didn't know which to believe, if any. And so actually our conclusion from this, and the title of my talk in that day in Symposium 3 years ago, was that it was titled, When Observational Studies Cannot Be Used for Causal Inference. And this was the example that I used. So 2 years later, and the one result that we did not find, I'll just say, the one result that we could not demonstrate was benefit. Right? We saw harm and we saw null. But what the randomized trial showed was benefit. So our conclusion from our observational study was don't believe this. We actually published an observational study that said don't believe this observational study. Those were the primary conclusions from the trial and from the study. And then literally a year later, we felt sort of indicated because the randomized trial did show benefit, which we didn't anticipate, but we certainly didn't think that the results that we got were causally credible. Dan has alluded to this. This trial, the danger shock trial, took a long time to enroll. It was conducted outside the US. We couldn't have conducted that trial in the US. Right? They had exemption from informed consent. They included almost anybody who could have been eligible, and even then, it took them a decade to do this trial. It was a selected trial. They had to expand their inclusion criteria to include danger. It used to be the Dan shock trial, became the danger shock trial when they included Germany. They added the UK. And so, there's still questions, there's still residual questions. And unfortunately, there was one trial that was ongoing in the US to study the same question. And that trial was terminated because the DSMB deemed it to be unethical to continue a trial in light of the danger shock trial. And that trial, which enrolled just a few hundred patients, did not answer all questions. So now we have the new family devices that are coming. And they're coming really principally to support patients with cardiogenic shock. We have one randomized clinical trial, which shows benefit. The question now becomes, does that device, the Impella device, should that now be the gold standard? I think people are considering that now, the reference standard for how we should evaluate it. Do trials need to be conducted? Dan talked about that the regulatory pathway for these devices, because shock is so challenging, has not been to do a randomized trial in shock, but it's kind of to do what I'd call a regulatory end around, which is to get approval for an indication, high-risk PCI, which is stable, it's a totally different condition, get those approved for that purpose, and then maybe take on cardiogenic shock in some other form. And actually, the original approval for the Impella device from Abiomed, it was not a randomized trial. They did a randomized trial in high-risk PCI, they got approval, and then enough off-label use happened for the device in shock patients that they were able to use that off-label use to get an approval. So what are the rigorous approaches that might use external data to evaluate treatments when RCTs are difficult? We've talked today about rigorously designed observational comparisons. Certainly the work that Dan is doing, and we're contributing to that, is the idea of that is a rigorously designed, prospectively designed observational comparison that I think overcomes some of the limitations that Sonia talked about in the beginning, which is data collection in a uniform strategy, having pre-specified protocols, taking away all of the non-randomization parts that are challenging for observational comparisons. Registry-embedded randomized trials. Now that we have these registries, can there be registry-embedded randomized trials in the AHA registry? Last time we spoke, Issa spoke about transportability. And transportability, we have now a trial that is conducted OUS. So can we learn something about US patients based on a transportability approach, maybe from the study OUS? And then Issa just talked about augmented randomized comparisons, the idea of using external controls, external data to make randomized controlled trials easier, smaller, more highly powered. And so we are doing much of the same. It was really interesting to hear talk, Lorenzo, because so much of the work that you're doing to validate approaches is work that we're interested in at the Smith Center for a whole assortment of questions in the cardiovascular space. So we're collaborating with the danger shock investigators, working with them, their data sets. We're collaborating with the AHA Shock Registry and the Shock Working Group and with the FDA to do a few different things. One is we want to see if we can emulate the danger shock trial within the cardiogenic shock working group registries and the AHA shock registry. These registries weren't around. Certainly they weren't as well developed when we talked about this 3 years ago. Now they are. So now they have, maybe do they have all of those, that crazy list of things that I showed you that make me choose a device versus not a device? Maybe the registries have that because they really do have rich data in those registries. We want to do a transportability analysis of the danger shock trial. Christina Lalani's leading our analysis in conjunction with the danger shock investigators to transport danger shock trial to a national US sort of population. We'd like to do a trial augmentation approach. We'd like to build a model, a predictive model within the shock working group registry, the AHA shock registry, apply it to the analysis of the danger shock trial and see those underpowered subgroups in that trial. Can we get more power out of them? What would have been the theoretical power gain in the danger? Could they have terminated the trial, say, at 7 years and not 10? Had they had that approach in their arms? And then, of course, there is this AHA-CRF collaboration, which Dan has spoken about prospective single-arm trials of experimental devices with concurrent, similarly conducted single-arm trials of controls. So I think I've talked about testing the limits of trial emulation. I think we're going to do that. I already spoke about this. This is an example on the left of an analysis that came out of the shock working group registry. And what it shows is that I think the most impressive thing about that, and these are sort of how patients progress within the first 72 hours of their presentation. And I think from my standpoint as someone who's interested in target trial emulation, working with this group here is, wow, they really have rich data to be able to characterize how people move from one state to another within 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 hours because they have multiple points of data collection, hemodynamic assessment, and labs. And if you have those data and if you can't do a target trial emulation and recreate danger, then you probably never will be able to if you can't do it there. I do also think that what Dan's approach highlights is that real-world studies can be designed and conducted more like RCTs. I shouldn't say real-world, I should say observational studies. Can be conducted more like RCTs. They can be registered. You can have clearly stated hypotheses. You can pre-specify analyses. You can have high-quality data collection. In the case of the CRF proposal, you can have exactly the type of prospective data collection and rigorous adjudication that you do for randomized trials. It's rarely done. Usually we think of real-world data analyses as being data off-the-shelf electronic health record data. I have many concerns about one arm using a different approach for data collection than another arm using different approach for data collection. In Dan's approach, it would be harmonized. And I think then we can fall back on really focusing on the one that I think is the challenge that we think is the most challenging, which is conditional exchangeability assumption that's built into randomization. And then maybe one starts to think about potentially about natural experiments that might overcome some. So this is my last slide before we have a conversation, which is what approaches will meet the standard to support FDA approval. Because there's one thing to do an observational study because we are clinically interested, and there's another bar that's needed to meet the standard for regulatory approval, reimbursement, et cetera. And currently used devices gain shock indications through post-approval off-label use in registries. So they didn't actually require a particularly high level of evidence, but I would say the evidence bar is rising. So what's going to constitute sufficiently high quality evidence in support of a shock indication? I don't think we all know the answer to that yet. I think many people in this room are working with the FDA to sort of get a sense for what that's going to be. They've signaled that randomized trials may not be needed to support a shock indication. But will device versus device comparisons be enough to offset the confounding? Part of the issue, I think the challenge of our analysis that we did, Impella versus no treatment, is that is just more an inherently biased comparison than I think what's being proposed, which is a device-to-device comparison, where everybody theoretically is eligible for the device. But I have concerns about how we're going to manage consent, right? If an experimental treatment, whether it's a single-arm study, a single-arm experimental treatment requires consent. The control group probably should require a similar consent as is being proposed, but it's probably not going to be consented exactly at the same time. It can't be exactly the same, and are we concerned that might introduce some biases? So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can open the door to a great panel discussion.